Johnny then invited her to tell the millions of people watching at home about her harrowing experiences with this terrible man. In the recreation room, Carter squeezed his eyes shut tighter, bracing for the impact of her words. On the screen, Amby took a deep breath. She began by admitting that when she first met Sergeant Carter, he had indeed deeply impressed her as being a terribly ill-tempered and angry man. She recounted how he had been shouting and yelling at her dear friend, ordering him to perform tasks that, to her civilian eyes, seemed completely unnecessary and cruel. Johnny Clark nodded sympathetically, summarizing her point by suggesting the sergeant was acting like a total tyrant. Amby agreed. She went on to explain that when she had returned to the base earlier that very day, the exact same behavior had occurred again. There the sergeant was shouting and yelling and screaming at the top of his lungs, in a manner she felt was entirely uncalled for. She confessed that she had walked away with the firm impression that Sergeant Carter was a totally unreasonable and impossible human being. Johnny Clark leaned back, looking satisfied with the drama she was providing. He asked if that was her final verdict. Amby paused. She looked directly into the television camera. She raised her chin slightly and stated clearly that her opinion had changed. She explained to the baffled host and the silent television audience that later that afternoon, she had sat down and had a long, serious talk with her friend, Gomer. She confessed that Gomer had patiently pointed out a few crucial things to her, things she simply had not realized or understood before. She admitted her mistake, stating that she had been judging military procedures entirely from a civilian point of view, which was deeply unfair. She smiled warmly, relaying what Gomer had taught her. She explained that Gomer had made her see that no matter how loudly Sergeant Carter screamed, or how fiercely he yelled, his absolute only intention was to mold Gomer into a better, stronger Marine. Johnny Clark looked confused. He asked incredulously if she meant to say that Gomer did not mind the incessant screaming and yelling. Amby laughed lightly, shaking her head. She exclaimed, "Heavens, no, he did not mind it at all." She explained that Gomer was completely used to it. She detailed how Gomer had explained the logic behind the punishments. Whenever Sergeant Carter made a soldier move heavy sand piles back and forth in the hot sun, or force a man to do endless push-ups in the dirt, it was never done out of cruelty. It was done strictly to help that soldier build muscle memory, to help him remember never to make the same dangerous mistake twice. Because in a real war, a mistake did not mean a scolding. It meant lives were lost. The television host was momentarily speechless. He quickly recovered, noting with a forced chuckle that her friend Gomer certainly seemed to have completely changed her mind for her. Amby nodded firmly. She delivered her final verdict, stating clearly that apparently Sergeant Carter absolutely had to do what he was doing and act the way he was acting, because if he did not maintain that fierce discipline, he would inevitably end up leading a platoon entirely full of knuckleheads who might get themselves hurt. In the recreation room, absolute silence reigned for 3 seconds. Then, the entire room erupted into deafening cheers. The soldiers clapped Gomer on the back. One of the men yelled out to Carter, laughing that the little old lady had just made a national hero out of him. Carter stood frozen, staring at the television screen in complete shock. Slowly, a massive, genuine smile spread across his rugged face. He whispered a blessing upon her heart. He puffed out his chest, turning to his men, and declared loudly that he had known all along she would eventually change her mind once she had a real chance to sit down and logically think about the situation. He pontificated with immense relief that civilians simply had a lot to learn about the complexities of the military lifestyle. The next morning, the atmosphere in the administrative office was remarkably light. Carter sat at his desk, humming a cheerful tune while reviewing paperwork. Corporal Boyle noted the change, commenting on the new day and the new world they seemed to be living in. He teased the superior officer, reminding him that just yesterday, the great Sergeant Carter had been terrified of losing his hard-earned stripes. Carter scoffed, denying the accusation immediately. He claimed he was never truly afraid. When Boyle raised an eyebrow, Carter amended his statement slightly, admitting he might have been briefly terrified, but he was certainly never afraid. Their banter was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Gomer stepped inside, followed closely by Aunt Bee. She was dressed in her traveling clothes, carrying a small suitcase in her ever-present purse. Gomer greeted the sergeant cheerfully. Aunt Bee offered a warm, polite hello. Gomer explained that Aunt Bee was just fixing to leave town to catch her bus to Fresno, but she had absolutely refused to leave the base without coming by to say a proper goodbye to Sergeant Carter. Carter stood up immediately, his respect for the woman now genuine and profound. He walked around his desk, telling her that it was incredibly nice of her to stop by. He lowered his head slightly, expressing his deep, sincere gratitude for the kind and understanding things she had said about him and the Marine Corps on the television broadcast the previous night. He added a charming compliment, noting that she had performed beautifully and that she was remarkably photogenic on the television screen. Aunt Bee blushed slightly, waving off the compliment but thanking him warmly. She glanced at her watch, noting that her bus would be leaving the station shortly. She extended her hand, telling Carter that despite their rocky start, it had truly been a pleasure to meet him and to understand the important work he was doing. She sincerely hoped their paths would cross again sometime in the future. Carter shook her hand firmly, returning the sentiment completely. As Aunt Bee turned to leave, her sharp, domestic eyes caught the light streaming through the large windows behind Carter's desk. She stopped, her head tilting slightly to the side as she inspected the glass. She turned back to Carter, asking innocently if this office was where he did all of his important administrative brain work. Carter puffed up proudly, confirming that yes, this was a command center. He looked to Corporal Boyle for agreement, and Boyle quickly chimed in with an enthusiastic right. Sarge. Aunt Bee stepped closer to the windows, squinting her eyes. She asked Carter, with a tone of mild maternal disappointment, when the very last time those windows had been properly cleaned was. Carter blinked, confused by the sudden change in topic. He looked at the windows, asking what in the world was the matter with them. Aunt Bee clicked her tongue, stating plainly that they looked awfully grimy and streaked, letting in a very poor quality of light. She checked her watch again. She calculated aloud that she still had a full hour and a half before her bus was scheduled to depart. A familiar spark ignited in her eyes. She turned to Gomer, who was already smiling, knowing exactly what was coming next. She asked Gomer, in a tone that was less of a question and more of a direct order, if he would be a dear and go fetch her that large bottle of vinegar from the mess hall again. Carter, sensing a disruption to military order, immediately stepped forward. He raised his hands, stammering that they needed to wait just a minute. He attempted to invoke military law, reminding her that according to strict base regulations, absolutely no civilian was ever supposed to perform labor in a military office. Aunt Bee completely ignored his protests. She removed her cardigan, rolling up her sleeves with determination, as Gomer happily jogged out the door to fetch the cleaning supplies. Aunt Bee turned back to the exasperated sergeant. She shook her head, muttering loud enough for both military men to hear. She stated once again that she simply would never understand why the entire United States Marine Corps stubbornly refused to pay a few extra dollars to have a good, hard-working woman come in just once or twice a week to keep the place looking respectable. Sergeant Carter looked at Corporal Boyle. Boyle looked back, hiding a smirk behind his hand. Carter sighed a long, defeated sound. He realized that against the unstoppable force of Aunt Bee armed with a bottle of vinegar, the United States military regulations did not stand a single chance. He leaned back against his desk, crossed his arms, and silently prepared to watch the cleanest windows Camp Henderson had ever seen emerge from a grime, secretly grateful for the unstoppable, motherly force of nature that had briefly taken command of his platoon. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling expanse of Camp Henderson, a United States Marine Corps base that seemed to hum with the constant, disciplined energy of thousands of men in uniform. The Californian heat shimmered above the asphalt pathways. casting long, wavering shadows across the impeccably manicured lawns and the ridges